For me, when I think about gratitude, I sort of see it as two different avenues. The first one is feeling gratitude, and then the second is practicing gratitude. There has been a ton of research that would suggest that when we practice gratitude, when we think back to those moments of joy or happiness or satisfaction, we are sort of reliving it in the moment. Employees have unique appreciation languages, and using the wrong one might lead to a misunderstanding or feelings of being undervalued. So, when it comes to practicing gratitude in the workplace, here are some things that I feel we should all keep in mind. One, asking that question of what makes you feel appreciated. Two, asking how they want to be recognized, because those are two different things. I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome to Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White. And so before we get into today's topic, which I'm really excited about, I just want to take a moment to address the elephant in the room, which is that it has been over a year since I've done a podcast episode. And while I wish I could blame it on circumstances, I feel the need to take accountability for just my actions. And not that they have been bad, it's just that I've been really distracted by life events. And by allowing those life events to distract me, it took away from the things that I enjoy, like doing podcast episodes or even doing morning messages. If you look at my YouTube channel for the past year, it's a lot of shorts. Up until recently with doing my 12/12 birthday countdown, which is something I felt like I needed to do, and I'm really glad that I did do because it helped to provide that energy of putting content out and sharing my thoughts and ideas. And so because of these challenges, I felt the need to focus on gratitude, because I find that gratitude is just a great way to reset our energy. I have talked about gratitude in the past on this podcast, and I even do my gratitude at the end of each episode. So that just sort of gives you an idea of how significant it is to me in my life. And one of the things that I noticed is because of those distractions, even my ability to express gratitude was being impacted. But ultimately, what I've learned in doing this process is that I needed to reset. And part of that reset was making sure that I was investing the time and energy into expressing gratitude. And so, since I am in my gratitude era, I felt like, why not spend an episode talking about that on here? And so that is essentially what our topic will be today. Just sort of bridging the gap between gratitude and leadership. And to be honest, this idea actually came to me from a speaker that I heard. I was moved by this one particular quote and decided, you know what, I need to talk about this on Things My Boss Never Told Me. And so I feel like now is the prime time to really talk about this because, again, I'm in my gratitude era right now. And so I figure, why not start out by talking about gratitude as we sort of transition into this next series of episodes, right? And so with that said, let me start by telling you about this guest speaker. So some of you may be familiar with Tavis Smiley, who is an entrepreneur, an author. He's been in broadcasting, he's been in films and on television. And so he has a very well-known presence. And he happened to be the keynote speaker for a banquet that I was attending. In listening to him deliver his keynote speech to a group of young men who were middle school to high school age, he talked about the significance of leadership and how they are leaders for their community and how they should continue to develop that leadership. And so one of the things that really stood out to me in his keynote was this quote, "Gratitude is the gateway to greatness." And that really resonated with me because, one, I talk about gratitude quite a bit, as you heard in the first 5 minutes of this episode. But two, it also gave me this aha moment of recognizing that I've never really bridged the gap between gratitude and leadership in the past. And so I felt the need to invest some time talking about that here with all of you. While in the past I have talked about the significance of gratitude, at the end of each episode I express gratitude, but what this episode is about is really understanding how we as leaders could do a better job of expressing gratitude and doing so in a way that's appropriate, and looking at some different examples of how to go about doing so. And so that is essentially what we will be focusing on today, leadership and gratitude. So with that said, let's talk about what gratitude is, because for some people, it may be a term that's sort of thrown around a lot. There's quite a few people who talk about gratitude as a mindfulness practice, especially if you're someone who is very spiritually connected. Gratitude is such a major component for just everyday living. And so as always, I feel like we need to sort of establish a basis of understanding, right? For me, when I think about gratitude, I sort of see it as two different avenues. The first one is feeling gratitude, and then the second is practicing gratitude. So when it comes to feeling gratitude, it's having that moment where we feel a genuine sense of gratefulness or appreciation for something, whether that be a gift we receive, a positive experience, or even some kind words, where we feel something a little warm inside of us, right? And it may cause us to smile or chuckle or just feel a little something different on the inside. It's one of those hard emotions to express because it can be very different for each person. I know for me, when I feel gratitude, I just feel this sense of joy. Now, when it comes to practicing gratitude, that is a little bit more action oriented. And it's essentially just taking the time to intentionally recall the feelings that invoke that sense of joy or satisfaction. And so practicing gratitude is thinking back to that present that we received, or that fun event that we attended, or that compliment that we received. Just thinking about it and just sitting in that energy. And so the difference between the two is when we feel gratitude for something that takes place, it's in the moment. But when we're practicing gratitude, we are recalling those feelings back to us. And what I want to point out is that we are doing this intentionally. Why? There has been a ton of research that would suggest that when we practice gratitude, when we think back to those moments of joy or happiness or satisfaction, we are sort of reliving it in the moment. And from a spiritual standpoint, there is a belief that when we invest the time in practicing gratitude, we are presented with more things to be grateful for. For example, let's say we are having a really great day and we take a moment to acknowledge, I'm having a really great day today. And that's sort of one way of expressing gratitude. And as you are reflecting on just the awesomeness of the day, then you notice other great things sort of fall into place. For example, you may notice, you know what? There were no clouds in the sky today. That is so cool. And then the next thing may be, wow, this cup of coffee tastes amazing. And then the next thing may be, wow, there was no traffic as I was driving to work today. And so there is this belief that when we take those moments to acknowledge those good things that are happening, more good things will happen. And Part of it may just be that we are simply focusing our attention on the good things and not giving credence to the negative things. Ultimately, it's that action of investing the time to acknowledge it and feel it. And there has been a ton of research over the last 10 years, specifically around the subject of gratitude and the benefits that one gets from practicing gratitude. For example, improved sleep, better mood, a greater sense of happiness and fulfillment. And that's just a few of the benefits. There is a long list of them. In 2023, I did this whole series of 100 days of gratitude. And in that, I highlighted the benefits of expressing gratitude and why it was important to focus on gratitude as we were closing out the 2023 year. And so if you want to check that out on my YouTube page, it's a whole playlist of 100 different gratitude prompts. So frankly, I feel like expressing gratitude is something that we all should be doing. We should all be investing time to express gratitude. And it's one of those things that can literally take 5 minutes, whether you do it when you first wake up or before you go to bed or when you're driving in your car. Like, it doesn't require a lot of heavy lifting. There are some people who may write it out. They have a gratitude journal or just say it aloud or say it in their head. Either way, I highly recommend taking some time to express gratitude. And if you're not sure where to start, you can check out that playlist of 100 days of gratitude, but I digress. So now that we have an understanding of what gratitude is and why it's important, let's talk about gratitude in leadership. As leaders, it's also important for us to express gratitude not only for our own well-being, but for our teams, because we want our teams to know how much we appreciate them and the work that they're contributing. When it comes to expressing gratitude, I feel like there should be some ground rules, right? Because we don't want to do so unnecessarily. We don't want to do so out of context or out of character that would discredit us as leaders, right? We certainly don't want to celebrate bad behavior or promote something that we don't necessarily want someone to do. And so one of the key things is that in expressing gratitude to our teams, that should always be genuine. We shouldn't just be making stuff up to be grateful for when it comes to our teams. I mean, we shouldn't be making up stuff to be grateful for anyway. But for this episode, I highly recommend that we not make up things to tell our teams that we're grateful for. And I laugh because we should not be in the business of inflating egos. That's not what this is about at all. Again, we should be genuine in expressing gratitude. And so taking a moment to acknowledge something good that someone did shouldn't require a lot of heavy lifting, or to reinforce something that a team member is actively doing should not require a lot of heavy lifting. And if someone is not meeting your expectations, or if they're not doing something to warrant the expression of gratitude, then don't do anything. If anything, there should be a conversation with that team member about why they're not meeting your expectations. And so I guess when it comes to expressing gratitude in a genuine way, you shouldn't have to worry about how other people feel about it, because you're being genuine. And if there are people who take offense to it, then those are probably the people who are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And perhaps there would be an opportunity to have a conversation about how they can improve. But the key thing is that making sure that we are doing so in a way that is appropriate for the environment or work culture that you're in. I recognize that there are different companies who do things different ways. There are different industries that do things in different ways. It's important to have an understanding of what is appropriate for where you are, and that might require a little bit more research. But either way, we should have some idea of what is and is not appropriate for the environments that we're in. And I would say the last thing to keep in mind is that we should also be intentional about how often we are expressing gratitude. And that means giving a compliment occasionally for a job well done, not giving a compliment once a year or once every 6 months. Taking a moment to say, great job, you did that very well, or thank you so much for handling that. And on the flip side of that, it doesn't have to be something that is done every single time, because you also don't want to oversaturate, right? Because that could create some weird dynamics as well. You want to make sure that you're just doing so occasionally when you feel that it's the right moment. And that's where it goes back to it being genuine. It doesn't have to be every day, every week, every month, but just every once in a while, especially if someone does something really well or if they go above and beyond. Those are some great moments to express gratitude to that individual or to the team. And so just to recap, when it comes to expressing gratitude to our team members, we should always make sure that 1, it's genuine, 2, it is appropriate for the environment that we're in, and 3, we're doing so intentionally. So back in 2019, when I was knee-deep in developing my literature review for my dissertation, I came across this book called The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace, written by Gary Chapman and Paul White. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the 5 love languages, you may recognize Gary Chapman from being the author of that book. And so the 5 Languages of Appreciation uses the same principles that Chapman talks about in the 5 love languages, which are words of affirmation, acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, and physical touch. This other book with Paul White, he talks about how you can use those same principles in the workplace. And one of the things that they talk about in this book is how demonstrating appreciation in a meaningful way fosters trust, reduces burnout, and improves employee retention. And at the time, I was focusing on employee engagement, and so naturally that book came up for me. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to use it in my literature review because I needed a little bit more research data, and much of Chapman's work is anecdotal, but I still found the content to be helpful as I was making some transitions with my own teams. And so, for example, in 2019, that's also when I made a pretty significant transition from a director role to assistant dean role. And when that took place, my team that I had when I was a director was transitioned to someone else, and I gained an entirely new team. And so this was quite an adjustment for me, and I've talked about it previously. One of the things that I found to be helpful was considering the principles that Chapman and White talk about in this book. And so one of the things that I did as I was getting to know my new team was asking them 2 very important questions. The first one was, how do they like to be recognized? And each of them provided me with a different example of how they wanted to be recognized. In some cases, it was privately. In other cases, it was publicly, but they sort of each had their own preference. The other question that I asked is, how do they like to feel appreciated? Or what makes them feel appreciated? Again, they each provided some different examples. And in asking those questions, I was able to very quickly understand how I could connect with them in a way that was genuine. Since I was just becoming aware of the 5 languages of appreciation, this was really the first time I had the opportunity to apply the ideas that Chapman and White talked about in the book. And I felt like I had a pretty good impact, to be completely honest. For example, I had one staff member who was having a rough time, was very distrustful of supervisors, and by the end of that year, we had an amazing relationship. Taking that time to ask about ways that I can make them feel appreciated and ways to recognize them in a way that felt good to them was help. In fact, I feel like that was one of the things that was missing for this particular staff member. They really didn't have a lot of positive reinforcement. Investing that time in understanding their preference contributed to us building a more trusting relationship. Now, that's not to suggest that this was the only time that I applied these principles. In fact, I would say throughout my leadership career, I probably did some aspect of this, but didn't necessarily have a name for it at the time. And so in reading this book by Chapman and White, I was able to connect some dots. And so when it comes to showing gratitude for something that your team member has done, it's important to recognize that each person may have a different preference for receiving said gratitude. Now, if you are familiar with the 5 love languages, you may be wondering, how do the two connect? Words of affirmation and acts of service may seem pretty easy to understand, right? Just complimenting someone if they do a good job, or doing something nice for a person because they did a good job. Those seem natural. Whereas quality time and physical touch may be leaving some of you wondering, how do you do that in a work setting in a way that is appropriate? So when it comes to the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace, Chapman and White provide some really good examples. When it comes to words of affirmation, it's about expressing gratitude and recognition through verbal or written praise. In terms of acts of service, it's more so about providing support and help with tasks that can help put your team members at ease. And so let's say if you notice that someone is struggling with a project, giving them a little bit more support with said project, or recommending that they collaborate with someone else, so that you are recognizing that there is a need for some more support, and then you are providing them a solution. For receiving gifts, it is providing a tangible token of appreciation and being thoughtful with said token of appreciation. And so that could be in the form of a small gift or even a little treat. When it comes to quality time, it's very different than spending quality time with a loved one. In a professional setting, it's more about providing some more one-on-one time to maybe work on their development, or to collaborate on activities, or just giving that person some quality time to focus on something that is important to them. And then when it comes to physical touch, that doesn't mean you have to give your team members hugs. I mean, if that's what you do, if that is appropriate for the setting that you were in, by all means, just make sure we get consent first. But there are some other ways to show your appreciation in a physical way, like a high five, or a handshake, or a pat on the back. Now, can you think of different examples of where you did that, or maybe a supervisor did that for you, and how that maybe made you feel? So there are some different ways that we can go about expressing gratitude. Employees have unique appreciation languages, and using the wrong one might lead to a misunderstanding or feelings of being undervalued. And so it's important for us to make sure that we invest the time to identify preferences to create a more cohesive and motivated work environment. And so appreciation must be specific and genuine. Anything that is generic or insincere will have the opposite effect on our team members. So, something to consider. Now, I don't recall the book talking about this, but I see an opportunity to focus on our physical presence, because I feel like that also plays a significant role in terms of how we express gratitude for things that are done by our team members. And so something that I had to learn very early on in my leadership career is that I needed to smile more and not look so tight or wound up, which was certainly not my intention. I learned that my body language wasn't always conveying the same message that I was saying verbally. And I should have known better. I was a communications major in college. This is something that I learned, but I had never considered how significant that was in one-on-one meetings. I was always thinking about public speaking and how my nonverbal cues can have an impact on the message that I'm delivering. And it may sound silly, but I was not as attentive to my nonverbal cues in more intimate settings. And so I remember vividly having that conversation with a few of my staff members who were like, we like you, but we're not sure if you like us. And I was like, of course I like you. And they're like, well, we don't necessarily see that or feel that. And so that was an opportunity for me to receive that feedback and determine how I can go about making some improvements. And so I smiled more and I was a little bit more silly with them. And I felt comfortable doing so because at that time, I knew I already had their respect. They were able to give me that feedback in a way that was not offensive or hurt my ego in any way. And then I remember a year or so later having a very similar conversation with one of my team members who was essentially struggling with the same thing with the people that they were leading. And so I shared with him what I did to work on that. And it was very interesting to see all of that come full circle. And so going forward, I was the type of supervisor who would try to make sure that whenever I entered into the office setting, that I had a smile, that I said good morning, that I welcomed people. And while that may sound silly, trivial, or simple, I recognized that it actually did have a really big impact. And so as I continued this over the years, when I eventually got to the point where I was supervising my own department, we had our own little antics and it made the work environment fun. And so I share all of that to say that while it's important to keep in mind the ideas that Chapman and White shared in their book, it's also important for us to recognize how our presence can also be a factor. And this sort of goes back to what I shared in episode number 4 about mindfulness, just being mindful of the energy that we're bringing into a space. It's not just about the energy, it's about how we are showing up physically. What are those nonverbal cues saying to the people that we're supervising? And so that's essentially what I'm encouraging you to keep an eye out for. Okay? All right. So just to recap, when we invest the time to express gratitude, we are also helping to improve our teams, build trust, and increase employee engagement. And Chapman and White propose 5 different ways to go about expressing appreciation for the work of your team members. And it uses the same principles of the 5 love languages, which are words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, gifts, and physical touch. And if you want to know more about how to express gratitude or appreciation in the workplace, I highly recommend that you check out their book. And one of the things that I also encourage you to consider is how your physical appearance can also have an impact on how you express gratitude. For example, just simply smiling when you are around your team members. That may help them to feel like they're being noticed or see that you're in a good mood. So, when it comes to practicing gratitude in the workplace, here are some things that I feel we should all keep in mind. 1, asking that question of what makes you feel appreciated. 2, asking how they want to be recognized, because those are 2 different things. Investing the time to recognize them in a way that's appropriate to them can help with building meaningful relationships with your team. And so by asking these questions, we are taking into consideration the preferences of our team members so that we may act accordingly. However, it's also important for us to consider our own preferences, because how you are expressing gratitude may not translate to your team members. And so if you're familiar with Chapman's book, The 5 Love Languages, something that he talks about is how when we express love, we often do so based on our own preferences. And so if you are someone whose primary love language is giving gifts, you may be more inclined to give gifts to other people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who's receiving the gift sees it as love, because that's not their love language. The same applies in the work setting. If giving gifts is your primary expression of appreciation, that doesn't necessarily mean that your team members will feel appreciated, because that may not be theirs. And so you may be the type who brings donuts or candy into the workplace for everyone to enjoy. While they may enjoy it, that may not necessarily make them feel appreciated. Like, I think about the different places I worked, particularly the last place I worked, how very often they would have events with food and how that made people feel appreciated. Whereas some of the other settings I worked for, that wasn't always the case. And so I share all of that to say we have to consider ourselves in how we may prefer to do things, because we may be challenged to change it to the preference of others. And while it may seem like a lot of work and effort that you're putting into understanding the preferences of others, it's really an investment in your teams, and it's an investment in your retention. When it comes to employee retention, we save a lot more money by keeping the people that we want to keep, as opposed to constantly having to recruit. Recruiting and interviewing takes money and time, and these are resources that we can't always get back. And so rather than having to go down that road, let's just do a couple things to make our teams feel like we value them, especially the ones that we want to keep, especially the ones that are top performers. We want to make sure that they feel appreciated, because we don't want them to go to other places. We want to make sure that people understand that we see the value that they bring and how we want them to continue to bring that value to work every single day. And so if we can contribute in any way, why not it be something simple that we don't have to pay for? If giving gifts is the preference, then there was a little bit of money there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot. And even so, it is a small price to pay in comparison to losing those individuals and having to invest the time and money to replace them, right? And so when it comes to practicing gratitude in the workplace, we need to make sure that we understand their needs, but also understand our needs and how that could potentially conflict with their needs and preferences. So I feel like I've driven that home enough for this episode. And so with that said, I will express a little gratitude before we close out. So I am grateful for the speech I heard from Tavis Smiley, because it really prompted a great idea that I'm actually surprised I didn't think about sooner. But I'm glad that it finally did come to me, and that we are able to do this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. And so ultimately, I'm just grateful and feel like it was the stepping stones I needed to get here today to do this episode. And so with that, we will close out with this episode's affirmation. I am grateful for the contribution of each of my team members. And it might be good to say that aloud to them, right? Maybe. Why not give them a little compliment? Just a thought. That wraps up this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. I look forward to sharing more episodes very soon. And I'm working on some cool things to shake things up a little bit. So until then, thank you so much for listening, and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.